So today's daf is daf Hey. We're going to start on daf Dalid Omid Beis, and we're looking at She'ena Gavoa Sorat Fach. That's about 7 lines up before the end of the Yom. So the Mishnah has established that the minimum size, the minimum height of a sukkah is 10 tfachim. If it's less than 10 tfachim, it's psula, min nalan. And this is the main subject for today's shir. How do we derive that a sukkah that's less than 10 tefachim high is invalid? Itmar, we learned. Rav, Rabbi Chanina, Rabbi Yochanan, Rabbi Chaviva, Masnu. Now the Gemara takes a little bit of a detour here to tell us that in Seder Moed, the Kula Seder Moed called Kol Ki Hai Zuga. If you ever see that list of 4 Zugim, then so instead of Rabbi Yochanan, just change the ches to a nun tzaf, and then it becomes Rabbi Yonas. What does this group have to say? So, Mendy, I'll just show you where the places were on the bottom of Daf Daled Omid Beis. Today's Daf is Daf Hey, and we're up to the word Aram, which is 2.5 lines before the end of Daf Daled Omid Beis. Yeah, Daled Omid Beis, Aram. It's 2.5 lines up from the bottom. So first, the Gemara wants to figure out what is the height of the Aram, which housed the Luchos. And the answer is Tisha. That's explicit in the Torah, the 9 Tfachim high. I'll read the pasuk. This is in Parshas Truma. You don't have it on your page, but it says V'yasu Aron Atzei Shitiv Amasayim V'chetzi Arko I'ama V'chetzi Rachbo. So if you're talking about the width and the length, that's already Amasayim V'chetzi. But if you're talking about Kol Maso, and that's the height, then the Amma V'chetzi Kol Maso. So that from ground until the top of the Aron is an Amma V'chetzi. Now, an Amma is 6 tfachim. Correct? So therefore, an Amma V'chetzi would be 9 tfachim. But there was a cover on top of the Aron, that's called the Kapores. And that Aron, that Kapores for the Aron, that covering for the Aron was a tefach in thickness. So if you count now from the ground until the top of the Aron, if you include the Kapores, you have 9 tvachim, which is called an Amma V'chetzi, right? 6 tvachim plus 3 tvachim is 9, and then you add the Kapores, which is 1 extra tefach, gives you another tefach of height. So all told, you have 10 tvachim. Arekan Asar. Okay. Uksiv. And beyond that, the Torah tells us in that same context, in Shmos Parashas Truma, that Hashem tells Moshe Rabbeinu, after he commands him to create the Aron and the Kapores to cover the Aron, that's where I will speak to you, I will communicate with you. And above the Kapores, which you may remember, above the Kapores, they're the Kruvim, which we'll talk about soon. That's where the voice of God came to communicate with Moshe Rabbeinu. And now we turn to Daf Hey, which is today's Daf. Tanya, we learned in a Brisa, Rabbi Yossi Omer, Me olam lo yarda shchina lamata, v'lo olu Moshe v'Elio lamora. This is a deep mystical concept here, which we can understand only in limited terms. But what it means is that God has his abode, man has his abode, and never the twain shall meet. There's no overlap. And what we're going to say is the following, that to separate the domain of above from the domain of the bottom, meaning the highest place that a human being could reach is going to have to be 10 tfachim below Shamayim, below, let's say, we'll call it the Kisei HaKavod for the time being. We'll see if later on we may change that a little bit. So man can only come up to 10 tfachim as he ascends towards the Shekhinah. And the Shekhinah will not go down to the Aretz, below and dip below 10 tefachim, so that the human sphere is up to 10 tefachim from the ground, and the Almighty sphere is from, let's call it the Kisei HaKavod, down 10 tefachim. So the Shekhinah can never enter into 10 tefachim space, below 10 tefachim space of the Aretz, and man can never climb in, penetrate into that 10 tefachim proximity of the Shekhinah. And how do we derive this? Shenemar, Hashamayim Shamayim Lashem, the Aretz Nasan Livnei Adam. There are two domains. There's the domain of Shamayim, that's exclusive for HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Then there's the domain of man, that's exclusive for man. So Shamayim is up in Shamayim, and Hashem is there alone. There are no Bnei Adam up in Shamayim. The Aretz is for man alone, and Hashem does not come and enter into the Aretz. Now, we just learned, if you remember, that the voice of God came on top of the Kaporos. And that means the lowest place that God could come down to without penetrating into what's called Va'aretz Nasan L'Bnei Adam, to human territory, would be the 10 tefachim, up to but not below the 10 tefachim at the Kaporos level. Because up to the Kaporos, it's considered Aretz. And V'no'adati teaches me that Hashem came down till the Kaporos. That's as low as the Shekhinah would get in connection with the Aretz. If the Shekhinah would dip below that 10 tefachim height of the Kaporos, then it would be Lamata. And we just finished saying in the Bryce of Rabbi Yossi that Me'olam lo yarda Shekhinah Lamata. So what this teaches us is that 10 tefachim sets up a reshus, or a domain. And if you go up to 10 tefachim from the ground, that's going to be the domain of man. And therefore, the Shekhinah doesn't go down lamata, it doesn't dip below at 10 tefachim. And on the other hand, let's say Moshe Rabbeinu, will soon see, went up to Shamayim, and so did Eliyahu, two different psukim in Tanakh, but they only went up to, but not beyond the 10 tefachim below the Shekhinah. Because if they would have gone above that 10 tefachim, then they would be trespassing into the area of Hashamayim, Shamayim Lashem. So the Gemara right away asks, Lo yarda Shekhinah lamata? Is it really true that the Shekhinah never came down to the earth? And now that the Gemara is going to quote one pasuk after the other to prove that the Shekhinah in fact goes down to the earth. Vaksiv vayered Hashem al har Sinai, that at the time of Matan Torah, the Shekhinah itself came down all the way to Har Sinai. The Gemara says, wait a minute, you're making a mistake. It means it came down up to a point of L'mayla me'asar tefachim. In other words, whatever is what we call the karka har, right, the ground space of the har, the Shekhinah would come down to within, or a little bit above, I should say, 10 tefachim of that ground space of the har. Don't take the pasuk to mean that the Shekhinah came all the way down and rested on the har itself, because that would invade the privacy of V'aretz Nasan L'Vnei Adam. So there's a pasuk in Zechariah Navi, V'amdu raglav bayom hu al har hazesim. And the pasuk seemed to indicate that the Shekhinah came down on the mountain itself, all the way down to the ground, because otherwise the Shekhinah would be floating in midair. It would be suspended in air. And the pasuk says, V'amdu raglav. Amdu raglav sounds like the feet, so to speak. That's a metaphor for the Shekhinah came down to the har. And if you're going to tell me it's 10 amos lamala, then that's not called V'amdu. V'amdu raglav means, when I have my grounds firmly, my legs firmly on the ground. Gemara again rejects it. Lamala me'asar tefachim. Even though it says V'amdu raglav, we're going to interpret V'amdu raglav, not that the feet of God Kaviyachal came all the way down to the mountain itself, but rather it came down up to a point of a little bit above 10 tefachim from the karka, from the ground. Another question, another pasuk. What about the opposite direction? Lo olu Moshe v'Eliyahu l'Moron? Are you telling me that Moshe and Eliyahu did not go all the way up to Shamayim? Vaksiv, it says in Matan Torah, Moshe ola el Elokim. And that seems to imply that Moshe went all the way up to Shamayim. And the Gemara answers, Lamata me'asara. He did not go all the way to Shamayim. He stopped a little bit below Asara, let's say 10.1 tfachim. And he never entered into the Rishus, which is called Shamayim, which is the 10 tfachim all the way on top near the Shekhinah. But Ksiv, with regard to Eliyahu, the Pasuk Malachim Beis says, Vayal Eliyahu basa'ara hashamayim. Right, Eliyahu did not die, but rather he climbed up to Shamayim. It sounds like he went all the way to Shamayim. He did not stop short of Shamayim. And Gemara answers, Lamata me'asara. He went up to Shamayim, but not all the way to Shamayim, not to the Shamayim Lashem, which is the 10 tfachim below the Shekhinah. Vaksiv. Now we have a pasuk in Iyov. Now this pasuk is going to teach us that Moshe Rabbeinu grabbed onto the Kisei HaKavod. And the Gemara assumes that the Kisei HaKavod is certainly in the Shamayim. I mean, that's where the Shekhinah is. Me'achaz, he grabbed Pnei HaKisei, the face of the throne. Parshaz, Olav Hanonu. Now, the word parshaz is what's called a notrikra. And what's going to happen here is we're going to take the word parshaz, which is not really a word, and we're going to break it down into 3 different words that make a phrase. Omer Rabbi Tanchum, what does this word parshaz mean? Melamed, and here we have these 3 words, perash, or peras, shakai, right, the name of God, miziv, Shchinosa, ve'anono. So if you take the pei and the resh of the word peras, and then you take the shin of parshaz, which is shin daled yud, meaning the name of God, and then the zayin of parshaz is a reference to the ziv hashchina. So it means that HaKadosh Baruch Hu wrapped Moshe Rabbeinu around when he grabbed onto the Kisei HaKavod with the Shekhinah itself, the Anono, and his holy clouds. And it's all around Moshe Rabbeinu. So if Parshaz teaches me that Moshe Rabbeinu was completely surrounded by Shakai, it means that according to Rabbi Tarfon's drasha, the Ziv HaShekhinah, the Anan of Hashem, were on Moshe Rabbeinu. It means that Moshe Rabbeinu climbed all the way up to the highest places, the Makom HaShekhinah, what we call Marom HaShamayim. And the Gemara answers no. Lamata me'asara. It means that HaKadosh Baruch Hu went down below the 10 tfachim, and he surrounded Moshe Rabbeinu with the Ziv HaShekhinah and the Anan, and that's where Moshe Rabbeinu received HaKadosh Baruch Hu and held on to the Kisei HaKavod, but he did not climb up above the 10 tfachim limit. Mikol Makom.
Maybe I missed something, or it's going to come later. But what does all this have to do with this?
Oh, just give me
that the minimum height is 10 tefachim.
Right. What we're saying is that the sukkah has to be a rishus. It has to be a domain, and a domain requires 10 tefachim, and that's what we're proving for the fact that the Shekhinah could not be reached within 10 tefachim, and it could not go down and penetrate within 10 tefachim of the ground. So that 10 tefachim is called a rishus. And the Gemara is comparing sukkah as a rishus to the abstract definition of a rishus.
Okay, but it has nothing to do with like a sukkah can't be less than 10.
It can't be less than 10 tefachim because then it's not a rishus. Mikol the Gemara asks, Me'achaz pnei kisei ksiv. Moshe Rabbeinu is holding on to the Kisei HaKavod. The Kisei HaKavod is up there in Shamayim. And the Gemara answers, Ishtarbuve, Ishtarvile Kisei. The HaKadosh Baruch Hu lowered the Kisei to an area that's ad asar. That means it's below asar tefachim. And he made it possible for Moshe Rabbeinu to grab onto the Kisei. V'nakat bei, and Moshe grabbed onto the Kisei. So in any event, the bottom line is that we see, according to this understanding, that 10 tefachim is a rishus. It's an entity or domain unto itself. Now the Gemara goes back to the statement that the Aron was 9 Tvachim and the Kaporetz was 1 Tefach, all told, 10 Tvachim. Bishleim, I understand the Aron Tisha, Dichsiv, that's explicit in the Torah that the Aron was 9 Tvachim high, because when God commanded the building of the Clan Mishkan, he said, V'yasu Aron, aseshitim, amasayim v'chetzi arko, v'yama v'chetzi rachbo, v'yama v'chetzi komaso. So we know that the height of the Aron was an amma v'chetzi. And since, again, as we said earlier, an amma 6 tefachim, that means it's 9 tefachim high. Fine, that I agree. That's explicit in the Torah. Ela kaporas, but how do I know that the covering over the Aron was a tefach, minola? The Torah doesn't mention the height of the kaporas. And the Gemara answers based on a brisa. To Tani Rabbi Chanina, we have a brisa. Rabbi Chanina Kol HaKelim Shasa Moshe Nisana Bahem Torah Midas Arkanu Midas Rachanu Midas Komasam. With regard to all the kelim, the vessels in the Mishkan, God gives us the 3 dimensions that are necessary, including the koma, the height. But there's one exception, and that's kaporas. Because in the case of the kaporas, midas arko, midas rachba nesana, but midas kamasa lo nesana. The Torah says, "V'yasisa kaporas amasayim v'chetzi arko, v'yama v'chetzi rachbo," but it doesn't say a word about komaso. So how tall was the kaporas? Because that's the amount that we're adding to the 9 tefachim of the Aron to come to the conclusion that the Aron reached the height of 10 tefachim. And the Gemara answers this price of Rabbi Chanina, say ulaman mi pachol shebekelim. We're going to try to find the smallest of all the kelim. We're going to make a hekesh of sorts, an equation between the kaporas whose koma is not enumerated, is not stipulated, and the smallest of the kelim. Later on, the Gemara is going to ask, why do you take the smallest of the kelim? Why not the largest of the kelim? But what is the smallest of the kelim? That is going to be what's called the Mizgeres HaShulchan. In the Heichal, there was a Shulchan where they put the lechem upon it. And on top, there was a beautiful decoration that was placed on top of what's called the Luach HaShulchan. The Luach HaShulchan means, let's say the Shulchan is rectangular in shape, and then there was a covering over the Shulchan, and on top of that covering was what's called the Mizgeres HaShulchan, a special frame that was added to the Luach HaShulchan, to the top flat part of the Shulchan. And how do we know what was the thickness of that Mizgeres HaShulchan? Shenemar, the pasuk says, "V'asisa lo Mizgeres tofach sviv," and the word tofach is a tefach. So it means that the Mizgeres HaShulchan, that frame that was added on top of the Shulchan, was 1 tefach in height. Afkan tefach. So the Gemara asks, wait a minute, why do you grab the smallest height of any clay migdash, mishkan? Neilif mikalim gufayu. Why don't you look at all the kalim in the mishkan? They were all taller than a tefach. You chose the smallest of all kalim, meaning the Mizgeres HaShulchan, and you established that the kaporas, which has a height that's undefined, has a tefach of height, by equating it with what? Mizgeres HaShulchan. Who told you that you should choose the smallest of all the kalim? And for example, we have other kalim, we'll see as we go along, that have a greater height. And here the Gemara formulates and applies a principle. The principle that we're about to learn is very famous. It appears in many, many sugyas all over Shas. Tafasta meruba lo tafasta. Tafasta muat tafasta. Whenever you have something that's undefined and you have to define it, you always take the smallest number and never the larger number. Look for the smallest number. And why is that? Because you can always add if, let's say, you undershot. But if, on the other hand, you overshoot and you take a larger shear, then that becomes what's called sheker if somebody contends that you should I challenge you, you should take the smaller shear. So it's always a good idea to settle with the smaller shear. And whenever the Torah leaves something ambiguous and undefined, it's giving us a pointer that we should take the smaller shear. Why? Because tafasta, beruba lo tafasta. If you're going to take the largest shear, then somebody's going to try to, contradict you and prove you to be a liar. If you take a smaller shear, so you could always say, all right, I didn't take the full shear, I took half the shear. That's also included in the shear. I'll just add something to the shear. But if you go beyond the shear, then you're adding something that is absolutely disqualified, and you're going to be accused of being a shakran, of being a liar.
What's this Garrett? Can you call that a kli? It's just like
excellent. That's going to be the sugi that we're going to learn now. There's something called kishut kli, and there's something called hechsher kli, and there's something called gufa kli. There are actually 3 categories. And just to give you a little preview of what's coming around the bend, don't be bored when we learn the Gemara. There's going to be a machlokes exactly where the Masechet HaShulchan was. One opinion is that immediately after they structured the Shulchan, they put down the Masechet, and then they put the Luach HaShulchan on top. Okay, we'll get to it. And that would indicate that the Masechet HaShulchan is really a part and parcel of the Shulchan, because the Shulchan goes until it's flat top. The other Mandiyom says, no, they put the flat top first, that's called the Luach HaShulchan, and then they added the Masechet on top as a beautification, as an ornament, and then it's not really part of the Kli. So the Gemara is going to say that our Shakla V'Tarya is dependent upon those 2 opinions. So the Gemara asks, but they lift me tzitz. You're telling me that the smallest of all the Caleb is the Masechet HaShulchan. That's not true. The tzitz, which is one on the forehead of the Kohen Gadol, is even smaller than the Masechet HaShulchan. The Sanya we learned in the Brisa, how is the tzitz constructed? Tzitz dome kemin tas shel zahav. A tas is when you have, let's say, a metal, and then you flatten out the metal. So they flattened out gold, and when they flattened it out, they made a tas. If you talk about for example, a flat, what's it called, where you put the food on Shabbos, what's called a blech, right? A blech. And in modern Hebrew, a blech is called a plata Shabbat. Anyway, plata is really a pach, which is really a tas in the Gemara's language. B'rochav shtei etzbos, and its width was only 2 etzbos. Umukaf miotin liozen, and it had to surround the forehead of the Kohen Gadol from one ear to the other. Because of Allah. Now here we have another machlokas. Exactly, there were 3 words that were inscribed on the front of the tzitz, but exactly in what order they were inscribed is a machlokas, because it had to say Kodesh Lashem, and Lashem is Yud Kei Vav Kei. Now, you would have said that Kodesh Lashem, the word Kodesh should be on top, and then you write the word Lashem. However, it says B'shtei Shitim, Kodesh Lashem had to be written on 2 different lines. I said before the 3 words, I meant to say 2 words. Anyway, Yud Kei Lamala, the Kodesh Lamed Lamata. Unbelievable. The word on top was Yud Kei Vav Kei, and then below it, it said Kodesh La. It was just a Lamed. So you read it from the bottom up. And the reason the Gemara says elsewhere in Masechet Shabbos they did it in that strange way, according to this particular Tanakhama in the Brisa, is because they were afraid that maybe they would write the word Lashem first. I'm sorry. Maybe they would write Kodesh La, and then afterwards they wouldn't write Lashem, or maybe they wouldn't write it in the proper way. So just to guarantee, they started with the word Lashem. That's according to Tanakhama. Rabbi Eliezer disagrees. Rabbi Yossi says, Anira Isi Rome, I was in Rome, and there's a whole story in the Gemara in Masechet Me'ilah that Rabbi Eliezer, Rabbi Yossi, and other Tanoim went to Rome. Actually, the Rashbi was there too, and they tried to be mevatel zeros that the Romans had decreed against the Jewish people. Anyways, a long Agadita, I don't have time to go through all the nitty-gritty details of the story, but suffice it to say that the Tanoim saved the life of the princess, the daughter of the Kesar. And the Kesar therefore showed him into the treasury and said, take whatever you want as a gift because he saved my daughter. And of course, they were tempted to take the tzitz, but they decided not to take the tzitz. They took the document on which it was written that the Jewish people will be, the decree against the Jews, and that they took out. And by doing so, they staved off a decree against the Jewish people. So their Ava of Klal Yisrael was even greater than their Ava for the Klei HaMikdash. In any event, they saw the tzitz, and what did it say? Because of all of Kodesh Lashem, B'shitachas. So it was written in one line. Okay, but what do we want to get out of this brisa? The width of the tzitz was 2 etzbos. Now, 2 etzbos is less than a tefach. In fact, 2 etzbos is half of a tefach. There are 4 etzbos in a tefach. So why not learn from the tzitz that if it was 2 etzbos, then maybe the kaporis was also 2 etzbos, which is a half a tefach. Why do you choose Misgeres HaShulchan? And the Gemara says, done in Kli Mikli, they ain't done in Kli Mitachshit. So right now, the Gemara thinks that Misgeres HaShulchan is part of the Shulchan itself. It's not a tachshit, an ornament, and therefore it has the status of a Kli Sharis. Whereas the tzitz is called a tachshit. It's called a tachshit. Again, this is complicated because a malbush is called a tachshit. I know in Chabad Hasidus, I'm sure they talk a lot about this, but anyway, but just on a simple level, anything that the Kohen Gadol had to wear as a malbush is considered like it beautifies his body when he appears in front of the Shekhinah, and therefore the tzitz is classified as a tachshit, and that's because it's the malbush of the Kohen Gadol. Okay. And the truth is that there is a pasuk in Parshas Matos, I believe it is, or Masai. Anyway, there is a pasuk at the end of Bamidbar that seems to indicate that the tzitz is a kli. So that's a long discussion. But either as it may,
what is the definition of a kli?
Well, right now, a kli has a function, whereas a tachshit is there just as an ornament.
So what would be the function of the tzitz?
So it doesn't have a function really. I mean, again, I'm making life a little bit easier than it really is. The tzitz does have a function, but right now the Gemara is holding that the tzitz really is not a function. It's really only a malbush of the Kohen Gadol. And as such, it's called a tachshit rather than a kli. And you and I would have said that the Misgeres HaShulchan is also a tachshit. But the Gemara holds right now, and the Gemara is going to reject this, that Misgeres HaShulchan is an integral part of the kli. It's part of the physical makeup of the kli. And therefore it's similar to the kaporos. So the Gemara now asks, V'nelech mizer. Now the Aron and the Mizbach HaZav all had what's called a zer. A zer is like a keter. And that was for purposes of beautifying the Aron, beautifying the Mizbach HaZav. The Omar Mar, Hazer Mashahu. Zer does not have any minimum height. And therefore, if we derive the shear of the kapores from zer, and once again, the Gemara thinks that the zer is an integral part of the aron or the mizbach hazav, then it's a perfect equation to the kapores. Kapores is kind of like a crown, right, on top of the aron, and you don't know the size, the height of the kapores, and the zer is like a crown on top of both the aron and the shulchan and the mizbeach. So why not equate one crown with another crown? And the Gemara answers, done in kli mikli, ain't done in kli mi hechsher kli. Now the Gemara introduces a whole new category, which is called a hechsher kli. Now, what's a hechsher kli? A hechsher kli is a nuance of a distance away from a kishet kli. It's really, in a sense, another way of saying kishet kli, but it's not necessarily a beautification, but rather it's a glorification. It glorifies the kli. And if it glorifies the kli, that is a precondition of the kli, but it's not an integral part of the kli. So therefore the zer does not have the status of a kli. Whereas the kapores is part and parcel of the aron, and therefore it has the status of a kli. And the Gemara believes at this point that the Misgeres HaShulchan is also an integral part of the Shulchan, and therefore it has the status of a kli. Wait a second. Misgeres Navi Hefshek Kliu. You've been assuming from the get-go that the Misgeres is part and parcel of the Shulchan. No. It's not part and parcel of the Shulchan. It's in addition to the Shulchan. The Shulchan is complete even without the Misgeres HaShulchan. The Misgeres HaShulchan is only there to glorify the Shulchan. The Gemara answers that we're now going according to one particular Mandi Omar, one opinion that has it that Misgarto Lemata Hoisa. In other words, they put the four legs up of the Shulchan, and then before they put the Luach, they put the Misgeres, and the Luach, which is the flat top of the Shulchan, like a tabletop, was on top of the Misgeres. So the Misgeres was built into the Shulchan as a major integral part of the Shulchan, has the status of a Kli, not a Hefshek Kli. And the proof is, because we're going now according to that Mandi Amr, who says that the Luach HaShulchan was placed on top of the Misgeres HaShulchan. The Gemara says, you're okay. There's a machlokas in Menachos Daf Tzadi Vav that Misgarto Lemata Hois, that when they built the Shulchan, they put the Misgeres HaShulchan on top of the Shulchan, and only then they added the Luach on top. So therefore, the Misgeres is an integral part of the Kli. But what are you going to say according to Rabbi Yosef, who holds a Misgarto Lemala Hois, so that first they put the Luach, and they completed the production, the manufacture of the Shulchan. And once the Luach was on top of the four legs of the Shulchan, it was already a Kli. It was a complete Kli. The Misgeres was attached on top of the Luach, and that's considered a Hechsher Kli. High Hechsher Kli. It's only a Hechsher Kli. It's not an integral part of the Kli of the Shulchan itself. It's only to beautify and glorify the Kli. And therefore, you have really just undermined your entire answer to the question, how do we know that the Kapores was one Tefach high? Ella, says the Gemara, we're going to have to find a different source and a different answer to the question. Like, for example, we asked the question, why not derive the height of the Kapores from a Zer? Ella, says the Gemara, Danin davar shenasna bo Torah mida, midavar shenasna bo Torah mida, the aim yochichu tzitz v'zar shelo nasna ben Torah mida klal. Gemara says the following, that in the technical rules of making a hekesh and deriving through analogy A from B, one of the rules is that we look to see where we can find two objects whose dimensions are spelled out in the Torah. So, for example, in the case of the Kapores, the Torah tells you exactly what the Orech and the Rochav of the Kapores. What the Torah left out was the Gova, the height of the Kapores. But that's very similar to the case of the Misgeres. Why? Because in the case of the Misgeres, the Torah gave us the dimensions of the Misgeres HaShulchan. But in the case of the tzitz, the Torah didn't give us any of the dimensions of the tzitz. All the dimensions of the tzitz are derived from Halacha Moshe Sinai or elsewhere. Zer, for example, the Torah didn't give us any clue what the dimensions of the Zer are. And therefore, we would rather choose an analogy between the Kapores and the Misgeres HaShulchan, both of whom can be described and classified as Nitna Bo Torah Midah, as opposed to the Tzitz and the Zer, where the Torah did not give us a Midah. And now the Gemara quotes an entirely different source, according to Rav Huna, to derive that the Kapores was one Tefach. Me'hacha, let's derive it from a parsha of Dam, of Hazos Dam Hapar Shel Yom HaKippurim. So let me read to you the pasuk in Parshas Achrimos. It says, "V'lakach midam hapar b'zav be'etzba'o al pnei hakaporos kedma." Now we're talking about the kapores, but we're talking about pnei kapores. And the pnei kapores, in the case of the dama par, which the Torah requires hazah be'etzbo on the pnei kapores. So we're talking about after the shechita of the par, and after there's a special kohen who takes care of the dam that was in a klisharis, but later on, the kohen gadol, when he's ready, after he finishes the other avodas, he goes to the side with him to the kodesh kadoshim, and that's where he does the hazah sadav, and it has to be bein shnei abadim, badi ha'oron, al pnei hakaporas kedma. Kedma means towards the east. His back is towards the west, and he's facing east. And now the Torah is telling me that the kapores is the size of pnei kapores. Okay, so what's the size of panim? Ein panim, a human face, hachos mitefach. The size of a human face is equal to a minimum of a tefach. Tzumoyes ve'ika ke'ape, debar yochni,